Welcome to Information Week's DOS Phone Hunt podcast. I'm your host, Joao-Pierre Ruth, and today I'm joined by Justin Cates, President of the International Association of Emergency Managers, U.S. Council, and Jason Friesen, Founder and Executive Director of Trek Medics International. We will be discussing ways technology can be part of responding to emergencies and calamities in the real world, rather than disaster recovery from an IT perspective. This week, the people of Maryland and the nation continue to address the tragic collision of a cargo ship that impacted with the Francis Scott Key Bridge, which spanned the Baltimore Harbor and port. Now, we are not here to examine what led to that accident. Those investigations are underway by various authorities, but we will discuss the role technology can play if and when there are emergencies that may involve multiple agencies from local, state, and even federal levels. Justin, Jason, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So Jason, please tell us a bit about yourself and Trek Medics.
Absolutely. And thanks again for having me on the show today. So my name is Jason Friesen. I'm a paramedic by training. As you mentioned, the founder, executive director of Trek Medics International. We are a nonprofit technology organization dedicated to improving access to emergency care and transport in resource-limited communities through technology. And we do that primarily through a cloud-based dispatching platform we build called Beacon. And Beacon, to keep it short, was born largely out of my experiences in Haiti after the 2010 earthquake and then the subsequent cholera outbreak, where it was evident that, in Haiti there was a total lack of a formal emergency communication system, yet everyone was carrying mobile phones around in their pockets, had vehicles to transport the sick and injured, and were willing to help, but there was really no coordination. So we set out to build a simple software system at the time that would enable people to use the phones in their pockets to alert, coordinate, and track emergency response. And so that started in about 2012. We launched the beta of the platform, and today it's a pretty sophisticated cloud-based platform that's being used in about 20 countries by a wide range of local emergency response agencies.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much for that. Justin, can you tell us a bit about your association's efforts?
Sure. So I'm the president of the International Association of Emergency Managers, IAEM. And our association is focused around the professionalization of emergency management and providing the necessary resources and technical assistance and professional development for those folks who prepare their communities and organizations for emergencies and disasters. Our goal really is to make emergency managers better emergency managers. And so we have members not only across the United States, but we have members in Canada and countries all around the globe. And it's really focused around trying to share the best practices and guidance so that we can learn from the various disasters and emergencies that occur across the globe.
Sure, great. Well, again, thank you both for making yourselves available to talk today. So let's start, I guess, with just the basics of communication and coordination and the technology that comes into play in emergency rescue and relief. Where and how does the response activity really begin? How does it typically start to happen, and where does technology come into play from what you've seen, or what are some of the first things that technology might be part of helping in that process as very real world things are happening, and possibly frantic situations?
Well, I can start off here by talking a little bit about the predominant way we find out about emergencies is through 911. A lot of times, those very small routine emergencies that we deal with across the country come through in a phone call. And those are processed by telecommunicators who need to understand location and the needs of that specific emergency, and then be able to determine what resources are needed, whether it be fire or law enforcement or emergency medical services, and be able to deploy those to the right location at the right time. And that's just for the routine emergencies. As the incident expands and becomes more complex, you have more and more agencies involved, and they need to be able to communicate with each other. So we'll see a lot of times public safety radio systems that are used to allow for them to communicate with each other. And then over the last few decades, we've seen an emergence of data-based systems that are being implemented to allow for folks to send text and video, audio to each other and share information at an emergency scene.
Gotcha. Jason, can you offer some input in terms of what the situations where you might not have traditional lines of communication, at least that folks might assume exist? What are some of the things that from your work that can come into play with kind of getting that emergency communication happening?
Absolutely. To Justin's point, here in the United States, where we have a formal national, as they call it, a universal access number, 911, that is exactly said, typically where all of this begins in terms of communications. It becomes problematic, however, when, let's say for Hurricane Katrina, right, where the power is out, the call centers, as they call them, the PSAPs, are flooded, or they lose power, or they lose connectivity, and then things really begin to fall apart. And what really depends upon there is what available connectivity there still is. So in the case of Katrina, for example, it turned out that amateur radio operators were the ones who really picked up the slack and were able to get communications going. Even simple SMS-based text messaging at that point, because smartphones weren't really available back then, but the SMS-based text messaging was also a very big component of emergency communications. But at that point, when you lose the central communications center, it quickly becomes a fragmented operation. And the challenge for emergency managers and disaster response teams is really to identify, who is the new hub of communications and who do they have access to? Because again, when communications fail, people don't even learn about how other communication modes are popping up. So it becomes a very fragmented operation. But we see in developing countries largely where they don't have a centralized call center or universal access number, that a lot of it happens over WhatsApp, right? Where they have these informal but very large chat groups, and that's how information and misinformation spreads really quickly. So if there is mobile connectivity, then these kind of grassroots or informal networks become the conduits for most communications.
Gotcha. It's interesting with WhatsApp. Is there a sense that, like having a more specifically dedicated resource that might be comparable to WhatsApp to kind of like help, clear up that miscommunication? Is that something that you're kind of like working on, or like that's a thought of like making that happen? Is to kind of clean up, make that available, but also clear it up so that real clear communication can happen. Is that something that's being discussed or looked at?
So the issue with WhatsApp is that while it's widespread and everyone is able to use it and is using it, the problem, and when in different countries it's different, right? So in Eastern Europe, Telegram is kind of the real big one. You look at the Ukraine conflict, Telegram is kind of where everybody is gathered. The problem with these chat groups is that they're free-for-alls, right? There's no structure to them. You could try to coordinate emergency response through them, but it's just this endless chat group, right? That not only is there critical information being passed back and forth that largely isn't vetted, but there's also a ton of memes and other stuff that has nothing to do with response that gets caught up in there. And so what we try to do is build a lightweight, what we're doing is building a lightweight CAD, as it's known, a computer-aided dispatch. And this is dedicated specifically to coordinate response operations. There is chat involved in it, but it's really about sending the right responder to the right location at the right time and keeping monitoring on them and tracking on them as best as possible, whether that's through SMS or through a mobile app with data connectivity.
Gotcha. What are some of the, initial, concerns that responders or emergency teams, in the immediacy of something happening initially, and kind of like that, the steps that are happening along the way once they're, starting to try and coordinate potentially across different types of agencies, maybe fire, rescue, police, and then, potentially other layers start to come in. What are some of the questions that start to happen, with the coordination of efforts that might be going on, and what are some of the things that, if they don't exist now from a technology perspective, would be nice to have to be developed to kind of help get some clarity of understanding of what's going on in a situation?
Well, one of the big challenges that we see as an incident scales up and becomes more complex is you end up having agencies that you don't frequently work with showing up at your incident scene. And so, if we look at the recent example of the incident that took place in Baltimore, many of those initial calls came into the Maryland Department of Transportation Authority, and they're dealing with law enforcement related activities there on the bridge, and taking in the initial report of the ship Mayday that now they need to try and close access to the bridge. But that doesn't mean that the local fire department is aware of the same information, or local EMS or any other law enforcement agencies that were in nearby jurisdictions. And so now you have a combination of those local public safety answering points or emergency communication centers that are trying to share information amongst each other. And then now having agencies actually showing up on scene and being able to try and communicate with each other via radio or face-to-face communications in a lot of cases, just trying to ensure that you have a command post where at least one representative from each of those agencies is there on site. If you listen to some of the dispatch audio from the incident in Baltimore, you can see them starting to make sense of the situation and starting to recognize some of the agencies that need to be involved and that need to be there represented at the event. Now, the biggest challenge, though, is despite having somebody representing that agency there at the command post, you still really don't have good visibility on the individual locations of every resource and asset that might be involved in that incident. What resources are not available, what resources are involved in certain types of activities. And there has been a lot of work over the last couple of years to try and provide more location sensing for responders, things like providing GPS access so that you can see where they're at in real time. And then also trying to provide more robust visual displays at the command post so that they can actually see some of this stuff in real time, which had historically really only had been accessible to those folks that were in a 911 center or an emergency operations center, where they've got the luxury of having nice screens and computers in front of them to be able to track some of this stuff. As things become more mobile, you're starting to see some of this actually get right out into the field, available to those incident commanders during an incident.